Physicists just took a wave, the same basic kind of ripple you would see spreading across a pond after dropping in a stone, and turned it into something that could carry quantum information reliably enough to fit an entire quantum computer inside a single 1-cent coin. That is not a metaphor, and it is not marketing language from a hopeful press release. It is a real, peer-reviewed breakthrough published in the journal Science Advances. And it just quietly solved a problem that had been blocking an entire branch of quantum technology for decades. If you have never heard the word magnon before today, you are about to understand why quantum physicists are suddenly talking about almost nothing else. Let's start with what a magnon actually is, because the concept sounds intimidating until you break it down into something genuinely simple. Inside certain magnetic materials, the tiny magnetic properties of individual atoms are not perfectly still. They can ripple in a coordinated wave that travels through the solid material itself, much like a wave rolling across the surface of water after something disturbs it. That traveling ripple of magnetization is called a magnon, and unlike photons, which are particles of light that can move through empty space or through optical fibers, magnons only exist inside solid magnetic materials. They are, in a very real sense, waves trapped inside a crystal, carrying tiny bursts of magnetic information as they move. Scientists have known for decades that magnons carry a genuinely exciting kind of promise for quantum technology, precisely because of how small they can get. Their wavelengths can shrink all the way down to the nanometer scale, meaning that circuits built from magnons, so-called magnonic circuits, could in principle be built directly onto chips no larger than the ones already sitting inside your smartphone right now. That is an enormous deal, because most current quantum computers require room-sized refrigeration systems, miles of specialized wiring, and enormous supporting infrastructure just to keep a relatively small number of qubits stable enough to function. A magnon-based quantum computer, by contrast, could theoretically shrink that entire footprint down to something you could genuinely hold between two fingers. So if magnons have been this promising for this long, why are we only hearing about a breakthrough now, decades after scientists first got excited about the idea? The answer comes down to a single brutal limitation that has haunted magnon research from the very beginning, and it is almost embarrassingly simple to explain. Magnons disappear almost as soon as they form. Until this new research came along, the best magnon lifetimes. Scientists could reliably achieve topped out at just a few hundred nanoseconds. A sliver of time so short it is genuinely difficult to even conceptualize in everyday terms. For context, a single nanosecond is 1/billionth of a second, meaning a few hundred nanoseconds is roughly the time it takes light to travel the length of a football field. That sounds fast, and it is fast, but for a quantum computer, it is nowhere near long enough. You cannot reliably store, process, or transmit quantum information using a carrier wave that vanishes before you have any real chance to use it. This is exactly the problem an international team of physicists led by Andrii Chumak at the University of Vienna set out to solve, and their results, published on May 1st in Science Advances, represent a genuinely dramatic leap forward. The team managed to extend magnon lifetimes from those few hundred nanoseconds all the way up to 18 microseconds. To put that number in perspective, 18 microseconds does not sound like a long time in ordinary human experience, but inside the world of magnon physics, it represents an increase of nearly 100 times over the previous best result. Nearly 2 full orders of magnitude of improvement, achieved not through some radical new theoretical breakthrough, but through careful, deliberate experimental engineering. At 18 microseconds, something genuinely important happens to how physicists think about magnons. They stop behaving like brief, flickering signals that vanish before they can be used, and they start behaving like something far more valuable, dependable carriers of quantum information that can actually be stored, manipulated, and read out with confidence. Researchers involved in the work have directly compared this new lifetime to the performance of superconducting qubits, the same basic technology already powering many of today's leading quantum computing platforms built by major technology companies. That comparison alone tells you how significant this leap actually is. Magnons just went from being a scientific curiosity to potentially competing directly with the technology already sitting at the heart of the modern quantum computing industry. Now, let's talk about exactly how the team pulled this off, because the method itself is almost as interesting as the result. The breakthrough came from combining 2 distinct techniques that, individually, each chip away at a different piece of the same underlying problem. The first technique involved deliberately exciting short wavelength magnons instead of the more conventional uniform magnons that most previous experiments had relied on. Short wavelength magnons turn out to be naturally less sensitive to tiny defects sitting on the surface of the crystal they travel through, defects that had previously been quietly cutting magnon lifetimes short in almost every earlier experiment. By choosing a fundamentally different type of wave to work with, the researchers sidestepped an entire category of interference that had been plaguing the field for years. The second technique tackled the problem from a completely different angle, using raw physical extremity instead of clever wave selection. The team took ultra-pure spheres, made from a material called yttrium iron garnet, a crystal long favored in Magnon research for its exceptionally clean magnetic properties, and cooled those spheres down to just 30 millikelvin. That is not a typo, and it deserves a moment of genuine appreciation for just how extreme that temperature actually is. 30 millikelvin sits only a tiny fraction of a single degree above absolute zero, the theoretical coldest possible. Temperature in the entire universe, the point at which virtually all thermal motion grinds to a halt. At temperatures this close to absolute zero, the random thermal vibrations that normally scramble and destroy delicate Magnon waves are essentially frozen out of existence, giving the Magnons a genuinely quiet, undisturbed environment in which to survive far longer than anyone had previously managed. Combining these two approaches, the unusually resilient short-wavelength Magnons and the extraordinarily cold, ultra-pure crystal environment, is what ultimately produced that nearly 100-fold improvement in lifetime. But here's where the story gets genuinely exciting. From a scientific standpoint, well beyond just the headline number itself, the research team did not stop at simply demonstrating a longer lifetime. They dug deeper into exactly what was still limiting Magnon survival even under these extreme, carefully optimized conditions, and what they found completely reshapes how the entire field should think about its future. The researchers tested 3 separate yttrium iron garnet spheres, each with a slightly different level of material purity, and the pattern that emerged was remarkably clean and consistent. The purer the crystal, the longer the Magnons inside it managed to survive. Even the least pure of the 3 samples tested still comfortably beat every previously recorded Magnon lifetime on record, which tells you just how far below its true potential the entire field had been, operating for decades. This finding carries an enormous implication that is easy to breeze past if you are not paying close attention. The limit on Magnon lifetime is not some unbreakable law of fundamental physics standing in the way of further progress. It is simply a matter of how clean and pure the underlying crystal material happens to be. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, because it fundamentally changes the nature of the challenge facing researchers going forward. If Magnon lifetime were capped by an immovable law of nature, the way the speed of light caps how fast information can travel through empty space, then 18 microseconds might represent something close to a genuine ceiling, a hard limit that no amount of clever engineering could ever meaningfully push past. Instead, the researchers have shown that the ceiling is actually set by materials engineering, by the practical difficulty of manufacturing crystals with fewer trace impurities, fewer microscopic defects, and cleaner overall structure. That is a problem materials scientists have solved before, repeatedly, across dozens of other technologies throughout the history of modern physics and engineering. It is a hard problem, but it is a solvable one. And solvable problems tend to get solved a lot faster than problems that require rewriting the laws of physics themselves. Let's talk about what this actually unlocks for the future of quantum computing. Because 18 microseconds by itself, while an impressive scientific achievement, only matters if it translates into genuinely useful technological capability. Researchers involved in this work have pointed to several concrete applications that suddenly become realistic once Magnons can reliably survive this long. The most immediate is the idea of Magnons functioning as durable quantum memories, tiny storage units capable of holding onto a fragment of quantum information long enough for it to actually be useful in a computation, rather than vanishing before any calculation can even begin. A second major application involves using Magnons as extremely low-loss communication channels directly on a chip, essentially wiring for quantum information that does not bleed away its signal the way conventional electronic wiring inevitably does. Perhaps the most exciting proposed application, though, is something researchers are calling a quantum bus. And understanding why this matters requires stepping back to look at one of the biggest unsolved engineering problems in quantum computing today. Modern quantum computers are extraordinarily difficult to scale up, not because scientists cannot build individual qubits, but because connecting large numbers of qubits together into a single coherent functioning system remains fiendishly difficult. Every qubit needs communicate with other qubits to perform useful calculations. And every one of those connections introduces new opportunities for quantum information to leak away or become corrupted by outside interference. A reliable, Magnon-based quantum bus could potentially connect hundreds of qubits through a single shared pathway, dramatically simplifying one of the thorniest scaling challenges the entire quantum computing industry has been wrestling with for years: There's one more property of magnets that makes this breakthrough particularly exciting for physicists working across different corners of the quantum technology landscape, and it involves something researchers describe as hybrid quantum systems. Because a magnet exists as an excitation inside a solid material, it naturally interacts with several other fundamental quasi-particles that exist in that same solid, including phonons, which are essentially quantized vibrations of the crystal lattice itself, and photons, particles of light that can carry quantum information across much longer distances through optical fibers. That natural ability to interact with multiple different quantum carriers simultaneously means magnets could potentially function as universal translators inside a hybrid quantum architecture, bridging together different quantum technologies that otherwise struggle to communicate with each other directly. Imagine a future quantum computer that uses photons to send information across a city-sized network, phonons to process certain calculations locally, and magnets to translate seamlessly between the two. That kind of hybrid architecture has been a long-standing dream in quantum engineering, and magnets with genuinely long lifetimes suddenly make that dream feel significantly more achievable. It helps to understand just how long researchers have been chasing this particular goal, because the magnet story did not begin with this Vienna experiment. Scientists have studied magnets and their potential for information processing since at least the 1950s. Originally in the context of conventional non-quantum electronics, an entire subfield eventually named magnonics. For decades, magnonics researchers focused mainly on building low-power, classical logic devices, circuits that could perform basic computing operations using magnetic waves, instead of electrical currents, promising significant energy savings over traditional silicon-based chips. It was only within the last decade or so that physicists began seriously exploring whether magnets could be pushed into the quantum regime, made cold enough and clean enough to carry individual quantum bits of information rather than simply classical signals. That shift from classical magnonics into genuinely quantum magnonics is a relatively young research direction, which makes this latest hundredfold lifetime improvement even more remarkable given how comparatively little time the field has had to mature. It is also worth explaining, in a bit more depth, exactly why the comparison to superconducting qubits carries so much weight among physicists reading this result. Superconducting qubits, the technology underpinning many of the highest profile quantum computing systems built by major technology companies today, typically achieve coherence times, essentially their own version of a lifetime measurement, somewhere in the range of tens to a few hundred microseconds under optimal laboratory conditions, though some advanced systems have pushed considerably further using increasingly sophisticated error correction techniques. An 18 microsecond magnet lifetime does not yet match the very best superconducting qubit systems available today, but it firmly lands inside the same general order of magnitude, which is precisely why researchers are treating this as a genuine milestone rather than simply an incremental laboratory curiosity. Closing that remaining gap, especially now that the limiting factor has been identified as material purity rather than fundamental physics, suddenly looks like a realistic engineering target rather than a distant theoretical hope. There is a genuinely interesting technical wrinkle buried inside this result too, one that deserves a bit more explanation for anyone curious about how physicists actually measure something as strange as a magnet's lifetime. Researchers cannot simply watch a magnet, directly the way you might watch a wave rolling across a pond, since magnets exist at a scale far too small and far too fast for direct visual observation. Instead, physicists excite magnets inside the crystal using carefully tuned microwave signals, then measure how the resulting magnetic signal decays over time, essentially timing how long it takes for the wave to fade back down to nothing. The dramatic difference between a signal that fades away within a few hundred nanoseconds and one that persists for 18 microseconds shows up clearly in that decay measurement, and it is precisely that kind of careful, repeatable measurement technique that allowed the Vienna team to confidently claim a genuine, verifiable hundredfold improvement rather than an ambiguous or easily disputed result. The choice of yttrium iron garnet as the material for this experiment also deserves a little more attention, because it is not a randomly selected substance. Yttrium iron garnet, often abbreviated simply as YIG among physicists who work with it constantly, has been a favorite material inside magnon. Research for decades, prized specifically for its unusually low magnetic damping, meaning magnetic waves traveling through it lose energy more slowly than they would in most other magnetic materials available. That property made YIG the obvious starting point for researchers trying to push magnon lifetimes as far as physically possible, since starting with an already favorable material gives any additional improvement technique, like the short wavelength selection and extreme cooling used in this experiment, the best possible foundation to build upon. Growing genuinely ultra-pure YIG crystals, though, remains a specialized and technically demanding process, which is precisely why the researchers' finding about purity mattering so much carries real, practical significance for anyone hoping to reproduce or extend these results going forward. It is worth pausing to think about what happens next inside laboratories around the world now that this result has been published and peer-reviewed. Science tends to move quickly once a stubborn ceiling gets demonstrably broken because other research groups working on similar problems suddenly have concrete proof that further improvement is genuinely possible, along with a clear, specific roadmap for how to pursue it. Expect competing laboratories in the United States, China, Japan, and elsewhere across Europe to begin racing to replicate and extend this result almost immediately, likely experimenting with even purer crystal growth techniques, alternative magnetic materials beyond yttrium iron garnet, and further refinements to the short wavelength excitation technique that proved so effective in this particular experiment. Scientific breakthroughs of this kind rarely stay isolated to a single laboratory for very long, and the international collaborative nature of the original research team already hints at just how quickly this specific finding is likely to propagate across the broader quantum physics research community. It is worth taking a moment to appreciate just how meaningful the coin size comparison really is, because it is easy to hear that phrase and assume it is simply a catchy way of describing something small. Today's leading quantum computers, the ones built by major technology companies using superconducting circuits or trapped ions, require enormous supporting infrastructure to function at all. These systems typically live inside dedicated laboratory rooms, wrapped in elaborate dilution refrigerators roughly the size of a large closet, surrounded by racks of specialized electronics, vibration isolation systems, and miles of precisely engineered wiring. The actual quantum processing chip at the heart of all that infrastructure is often startlingly small, but the machinery required to keep it stable and functional dwarfs the chip itself by many orders of magnitude. A Magnon-based quantum computing platform could, at least in principle, dramatically shrink that entire supporting apparatus, because magnonic circuits can theoretically be manufactured using techniques already common in the smartphone chip industry, and because magnons naturally exist inside solid crystals, rather than requiring the kind of exotic superconducting circuitry or precisely trapped individual atoms that other quantum computing approaches depend on. The long-term vision genuinely does point towards something dramatically smaller than what exists today. Nobody involved in this research is claiming a coin-sized quantum computer is sitting just around the corner ready for consumers to buy. The extreme cooling requirements alone on that 30 millikelvin environment still demand serious refrigeration infrastructure that is not going away anytime soon. But the fundamental building blocks, the chip-scale circuitry itself, could genuinely shrink down to dimensions that would have sounded like pure science fiction just a few years ago. If you are the kind of person who gets genuinely excited watching physics quietly rewrite what future technology might look like, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this stuff as much as you clearly do. Let's talk a bit more about who actually did this work, because the human story behind the discovery is worth understanding too. The research was led by physicist Andrei Chumak at the University of Vienna, working alongside an international team of collaborators, and the underlying experiment was conducted by Rostislav Serha as part of his doctoral thesis research. There is something genuinely fitting about one of the most significant Magnon breakthroughs in decades emerging from a doctoral student's dissertation work rather than from some enormous, heavily funded corporate research lab. It is a reminder that fundamental physics breakthroughs capable of reshaping an entire technology industry still regularly come out of university laboratories, funded by public science agencies rather than private venture capital chasing the next quarterly product announcement. The project received funding support from the Austrian Science Fund, along with additional backing from the German Research Foundation through a specialized research initiative focused on spin-based technologies, underscoring just how much of the foundational work behind future quantum computing hardware is still happening inside academic institutions funded by public research grants. It is also worth placing this discovery inside the broader landscape of quantum computing research happening globally right now, because magnons are far from the only approach scientists are pursuing toward building genuinely useful, scalable quantum computers. Some of the most prominent efforts in the industry today rely on superconducting circuits, which require extreme cooling similar to what this Magnon experiment used, but organize their quantum information using electrical currents rather than magnetic waves. Other major approaches use individually trapped and precisely controlled atoms or ions manipulated with lasers inside ultra-high vacuum chambers, or photonic systems that encode quantum information directly into particles of light. Each of these competing approaches carries its own distinct advantages and its own stubborn technical challenges, and it remains genuinely unclear which approach, or more likely which combination of approaches, will ultimately prove most practical for building large-scale, commercially useful quantum computers over the coming decades. What makes magnons particularly compelling within that broader competitive landscape is precisely the combination of properties this new research has just demonstrated. Nanometer scale wavelengths mean magnonic circuits could realistically be manufactured using semiconductor fabrication techniques the electronics industry has already spent decades perfecting, rather than requiring entirely new, exotic manufacturing processes built from scratch. Natural compatibility with existing magnetic materials means magnet-based devices could potentially integrate more smoothly with conventional electronics than some of the more exotic quantum computing approaches currently being pursued elsewhere. And now, with lifetimes finally stretching into the microsecond range, magnons have crossed a threshold that genuinely puts them into direct competition with more established quantum computing technologies, rather than remaining a purely theoretical curiosity that experimental physicists study mainly out of scientific fascination. There is one more dimension to this story worth exploring before moving toward the bigger picture, and it involves the practical engineering challenges standing between this laboratory result and any kind of usable device. Achieving that 30 millikelvin temperature required a specialized piece of equipment called a mixed-phase cryostat, an extremely sophisticated refrigeration system that physicists use specifically to reach temperatures this close to absolute zero. These systems are neither cheap nor simple to operate, and they represent a genuine practical barrier standing between today's laboratory demonstration and any kind of widely deployable technology. However, it is worth noting that essentially every leading quantum computing approach available today, including the superconducting qubit systems built by major technology companies, already requires similarly extreme cooling to function at all. In that sense, magnet-based quantum technology is not introducing some brand new practical burden that competing approaches manage to avoid. It is simply inheriting the same fundamental cooling requirement that has defined nearly the entire quantum computing industry from its earliest days, which somewhat levels the playing field when comparing this approach against its more established rivals. It is also worth spending a moment considering the specific research funding environment that made this discovery possible in the first place, because it says something meaningful about how fundamental science actually gets done. The Austrian Science Fund, the primary funding body supporting this work, operates similarly to national science foundations found in most developed countries, awarding competitive grants to researchers, pursuing fundamental curiosity-driven investigations that do not always promise an immediate, obvious commercial payoff. Additional support came through a specialized German research initiative focused specifically on spin-based technologies, reflecting a broader European commitment to funding this particular corner of quantum physics research over a sustained period of years. This kind of patient, publicly funded basic research is precisely the environment in which discoveries like this one tend to emerge, since private commercial investment typically favors research directions with clearer, nearer-term paths to a marketable product, while genuinely foundational breakthroughs like proving a decades-old physical limit was never truly fundamental in the first place, often require exactly the kind of long-term, low-pressure research environment that public science funding is specifically designed to provide. Consider also how this discovery fits into the larger story of magnetic materials, research more broadly, a field that has quietly produced an enormous number of technologies most people use every single day without ever realizing where they came from. Hard drives, credit card magnetic stripes, and countless sensors embedded throughout modern electronics all trace their origins back to decades of patient research into how magnetic materials behave at extremely small scales. Magnonics, and now quantum magnonics specifically, represent simply the latest chapter in that same long-running scientific story, taking magnetic phenomena that engineers first learned to exploit for relatively mundane data storage applications and pushing them towards something genuinely capable of powering next-generation quantum computing hardware. That continuity matters because it means the manufacturing expertise, material science knowledge, and industrial infrastructure needed to eventually scale up magnet-based quantum devices already exists in a mature form elsewhere in the electronics industry, rather than needing to be built entirely from scratch the way some more exotic quantum computing approaches require. And it is worth being honest about exactly how much work remains between this laboratory result and any kind of practical, commercially available technology. 18 microseconds is a genuinely dramatic improvement over a few hundred nanoseconds, but it still represents a relatively short window of time compared to what a fully mature, large-scale quantum computer would eventually need to perform complex, multi-step calculations reliably. Researchers will need to demonstrate that these long-lived magnets can actually be manipulated, entangled, and read out with the kind of precision and low error rates that useful quantum computation genuinely demands, not just that they can survive passively for a longer stretch of time. Building an actual working magnet-based quantum processor, capable of executing real algorithms rather than simply demonstrating extended coherence in a laboratory setting, remains a substantial engineering challenge, still waiting to be solved. That said, the significance of removing a fundamental physics ceiling should not be understated, because it fundamentally changes the calculus for how much research investment makes sense in this specific direction going forward. Before this discovery, a researcher deciding where to focus limited grant funding and laboratory time might have reasonably worried that Magnin-based quantum technology was fundamentally capped by some stubborn physical limit that no amount of clever engineering could ever meaningfully overcome. Now that the team has clearly demonstrated the limiting factor is simply material purity, a problem material science has repeatedly solved across dozens of other technologies throughout history, the entire calculation shifts. Expect to see a meaningful wave of renewed research investment and laboratory attention flowing toward Magnin-based quantum technology over the next several years, precisely because this result just proved the ceiling everyone assumed was permanent was actually just a temporary manufacturing limitation waiting for better engineering to arrive. There's also a genuinely underappreciated angle to this story worth spending a little more time on, and it involves how quantum research actually advances in the real world, as opposed to how popular science coverage often makes it sound. Breakthroughs like this one rarely arrive as sudden, isolated flashes of genius appearing out of nowhere. They tend to emerge from years of patient, incremental experimental refinement, chipping steadily away at a stubborn problem from multiple different angles simultaneously until something finally clicks into place. The Magnin field had been stuck at roughly the same lifetime ceiling for years, watching other quantum computing approaches like superconducting circuits and trapped ions attract the overwhelming majority of research, funding, media attention, and industry investment. This result represents exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous experimental persistence that eventually produces the breakthroughs flashy headlines love to celebrate, even though the actual day-to-day work behind it looked far more like careful materials, testing, and incremental refinement than any kind of dramatic eureka moment. Think about the broader trajectory here for a moment, because it says something genuinely important about how transformative technologies tend to develop over time. Quantum computing as a whole has followed a remarkably similar pattern across nearly every competing technical approach researchers have pursued. An initial demonstration proves a concept is theoretically possible, followed by years of researchers hitting a stubborn performance ceiling that seems to resist every attempt at improvement, followed eventually by some combination of clever new technique and improved materials that suddenly blows straight through that ceiling and reopens the entire research direction. Superconducting qubits went through exactly this pattern. Trapped ion systems went through a similar arc. Magnins, based on this latest result, appear to be entering that same critical transition point right now, moving from a promising but frustratingly limited technology into something genuinely competitive with the approaches that have dominated quantum computing headlines for the past decade. So here is the honest, grounded takeaway from all of this. Scientists have not yet built a coin-sized quantum computer sitting on a lab bench somewhere, ready to be mass-produced and shipped to consumers. What they have done is remove one of the single biggest roadblocks that had been quietly holding an entire promising branch of quantum technology back for decades. And in the process, they have proven that the roadblock was never a fundamental law of physics in the first place. It was simply a matter of building purer crystals and choosing smarter waves to work with, both of which are exactly the kind of engineering problems that tend to get solved once enough talented researchers turn their attention toward solving them. Coin-sized quantum computers, built from tiny magnetic waves rippling through solid crystal, are not sitting in stores next year, or probably even within the next decade. But the specific scientific excuse for why they could never eventually exist just quietly disappeared, and that alone is worth paying very close attention to. There is something almost poetic about the specific physical picture at the center of this entire breakthrough, worth sitting with for one final moment before wrapping up. A wave, fundamentally no different in concept from the ripples spreading across a pond after a stone breaks the surface, just proved capable of carrying quantum information reliably enough to compete with some of the most sophisticated engineered quantum systems humanity has ever built. Nature had the basic ingredients sitting there all along, quietly rippling through magnetic crystals for as long as those crystals have existed. It simply took physicists this long to figure out exactly how clean, how cold, and how carefully shaped that wave needed to be before it could finally hold onto quantum. Information long enough to matter. A reminder that some of the most consequential breakthroughs in physics are hiding inside phenomena scientists have technically known about for generations, waiting patiently for the right combination of technique and patience to finally unlock them. Before you go, if stories about physicists quietly clearing roadblocks nobody outside the lab even knew existed are exactly the kind of content you want more of, subscribe to the channel right now so you catch the next breakthrough the moment it happens. Because in a field moving this fast, the next quiet leap forward is probably already sitting in a research paper somewhere, just waiting for someone to notice. Keep an eye on this specific research group too, because teams that break a decades-old ceiling once using a clear and repeatable method rather than a lucky one-time result, tend to be the same teams that keep breaking new records again, within just a year or two afterward. And if this pattern holds, the next update on Magnon lifetimes could arrive sooner than anyone in the field is currently expecting.